Hi. So look at this. I'm holding it like the older on YouTube now. It's because I've nowhere to pin it. I could pin it up now. Yeah. So anyway, this is my response to Comics Patrol challenge. He did a video recently called Five Cool Comics. So they don't have to be like rare or collectible. It just be something that you find personally cool. So I'm going to do mine, and I might do something a bit extra at the end as well. I'll explain why. So my comics history in a nutshell. So I've been reading comics for a long, 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 long time, longer than a lot of people have been born, but been alive basically. Um, so I'll give you like a potted history. So I got into comics when I was about 6, and my first like grown up comic that I got into at 6 was a Marvel British weekly reprint of Planet of the Apes, because I was a huge, huge fan of Planet of the Apes in the 70s. And it kind of like went from there. I still got like being on other kids' comics at the same time. And of course, then 2000 AD came along in 1977, and I bought the first issue and I carried on buying it. Obviously, when I was a kid, I didn't have things like backing boards and bags, so they became ragtag and tatty and all like that. And then when Star Lord came along, I bought that, which was like the sister title to 2000 AD. Got Tornado, obviously, because that's the world's best comic ever, that's ever been created. Just ask Geeky Old Hog; he'll tell you how good Tornado is. And then, obviously, in the early 80s, Warrior came out, and at the same time, in the States, Heavy Metal magazine came out, and those two comics basically just opened my eyes to what could be done with comics. Of course, at the same time, in the early 80s, I was buying Marvel and DC as well, just from the newsagents or from W.H. Smith for some weird reason. Um, and then around about 1983, 84, I discovered that there was comic shops in Manchester. There was one called Odyssey 7, which is now Forbidden Planet. It used to be down Manchester University area. So I used to go there when I was about 13 and 14. And if I could make it on a Friday, if I could finish school early enough on a Friday, I'd just catch the bus straight down to Manchester. And it was like a mile and a half walk from the city centre to get to the comic shop. And I did it because I'd never seen anything like a comic shop before. But I used to get like a big breakfast. There was like this Greek takeaway restaurant kind of place, like all you can eat kind of place next door to it. So I used to get that, and then after I bought my comics, it gave me incentive to buy my comics. And that's when I got discovered things like graphic novels, but the very early ones. Like I remember picking up Saber graphic novel, which was an Eclipse graphic novel that came out in 1979, 1980, something like that. Very, very early. It's like done like on a sepia print. And he also got the very first. I got Luther Arkwright when it first came out by Brian Talbot in graphic novel form. Like I said, there was no word for graphic novel at that time, and I picked up The Stars Are My Destination by Howard Chaykin and things like that. So, comics and graphic novels for me have gone hand in hand in tandem since the early 80s. And of course, I got into stuff like Elementals, Comic Comico, Eclipse Comics, First Comics, um, and like I said, Marvel, which got me into Epic and the Epic Illustrated magazine and the Epic comic range of titles, and then of course DC with and Vertigo later on in the early 80s, late 90s. And I even bought, but it was the second printing, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1. I've never been the biggest Teenage Mutant Ninja fan, but I did like the first few issues. So I got the black and white comics when they came out, and then I got the first comics did color reproduction and tall, big graphic novels. Mage was one of my favorite comics as well at the time in the 80s. So comics have been my lifeblood, and all through that time as well, 2000 AD has always been a constant all through that time. So in the early 80s, 2000 AD was like so creatively exciting, like it is now. They're on such a high at the moment, and I do recommend people who've stopped buying 2000 AD to give it a go nowadays. It's really, really strong now. Um, so yeah, I've had, and like I said, I've loved you. Heavy metal exposed me to European comics, and it also exposed me to things like underground comics. So when I was 15, I used to go to the shop, which it's a weird shop. It's like a head shop. So it had drug paraphernalia in one section, and it had like a beaded curtain section, which had adults only on. So you went in there if you wanted to get your VHS naughty videos. This shows how hyper focused I was on comics because I was at the prime age for getting into that type of stuff. But I was hyper focused on comics, but I saw this. They also had this huge, like, second-hand and underground comic section. So I got exposed to Fat Freddy's Cats, Fabulous Fairy Freak Brothers, and Robert Crumb. The Fairy Freak Brothers still love to this day. I enjoy Gilbert Shelton a lot more than Robert Crumb. I know people sing praise Robert Crumb. For me personally, I've always gone against the tide. For me personally, Robert Crumb was my go-to. Not Robert Crumb. Gilbert Shelton was my go-to, not Robert Crumb. Um, and I also that's where I first discovered the Spirit because they did these big kitchen sink, these big magazines of collections of spirits, and they also did some EC ones which I never picked up because they always seemed to be a bit more pricey. But I got exposed to the Spirit then, and I actually got a Fantastic Four #9 from there. Proper comic of Fantastic Four, and it cost me. I traded a load of stuff in there. They were selling it for 15 quid, £15, which was about 1983, 84, because it had a little bit cut out at the bottom or something. There's some kind of um, imperfection on the cover. But even so, I mean, now, if I had that imperfect comic now, I could get easily a few £100 for it. But I bought it, and I think that was the first time I did a flip. So I went to Odyssey 7, and I swapped it, and I got a load of comics, and I also got the very first. This was on the Marvel Masterworks were coming out, so I got the Marvel Masterworks hardcover of the Fantastic Four first 10 issues. So, like I said, I'm one of those people who I've never stuck to one format. I like both types of formats. This is really long-winded. I've not even got to my comics yet. But so this carried on for 8 years, and then obviously I got married, and I had in my house when I was married, I had all upstairs. There was bookcases going all the way around. I must have had about 12 big bookcases going all the way around upstairs, and the same downstairs as well. The back room was just basically a huge library, and they were covered in graphic novels and comics. And we're talking now, this is about 17 years ago, and I had over 700, 800, going on for 1,000. Yeah, it's about 800 graphic novels, and then I had my boxes of comics as well. Um, but then, if we go back 15 years ago, my marriage broke up, and I had nowhere to go. I literally had to go back to my dad's, um, and there was no room for my comics, so I had to get rid of all of my comics. It's about 4 or 5 graphic novels that meant something to me, but I had to get rid of everything. Literally thousands of pounds worth of comics, a life's collection, um, and that broke something in me. That broke. I was a reader and a collector at the time, um, and it broke a switch in my head. So instead of just being a reader and a collector, where I used to love going for the hunt for the rarest books, I became just a reader. So for 10 years after, so we're talking what? So yeah, so when that happened, when I had to get rid of all my books, which was 15 years ago, it it just killed something in me for a bit. So I still loved comics. So, but because I had nowhere to keep them, I had no home. I was staying at my dad's. I switched to Comicsology just came out then, so I started reading comics digitally because at that time as well you could get comics like 40p, 50p digitally. So that's what I did, and I amassed again thousands of comics digitally, and that went on for 10 years. And like I said, I had a handful of books. Then I slowly started getting graphic novels again. Um, and then 7 years ago, I managed to get my own place, moved to a very small studio flat, which I love. It's cozy. So that's when I started getting graphic novels again, but in small amounts. And I started tipping my toes back into manga as well. So I started getting manga collections. But then it wasn't until lockdown when COVID hits into 2020, was it? That's when, like with everybody, I had cabin fever. What can you do to entertain yourself? And I always kept up with comic news even when I was just reading digitally. And that's so I looked on eBay and I saw there's some shops that were selling stuff, new comics online on eBay. And if you bought 5 you got like a 25% discount or something. So I started buying my first floppies in absolutely fucking years. And I think the first one I got was Batman and Detective. So we're talking about this about 5 years ago, and that's when so I started accumulating comics again. But like I said, the collector side of me was broken, so I have not had that urgency to get like first prints, to get like original copies. So instead of getting my old collection in comic format, I just bought them in collected editions, in trade paperbacks, in hardbacks, you name it. Um, because I've lost that urgency, that sentimental side of having it how I originally had it. Um, it's more I want the stories back, and I find it's much more enjoyable to read a comic in book format. So a lot of my comics now are very much graphic novel or collector's edition based, apart from comics from the past 5 years. But again, I still get a lot the new ones graphic novel based as well. So I'm not going to highlight. See, I'm getting to a point now. I'm not going to highlight comics that I've bought in recent comics bought in past 5 years, because I do a kind of weekly review show where I'll show you what I get anyway. Um, so I have dipped my toes back in the past year and a half or so, if that, of getting back issues. Now, where I live, the comic shops near me, they don't do back issues, so I'm dependent on eBay. So what I've started getting, my caveat is just to buy back issue comics of series that haven't been collected in either trade paperback or in the Epic collections or the DC Finest. It means just get series that might have just gone under the radar. They weren't big sellers, but they meant something to me. Um, and so that's what I've been doing, and they trigger memories. But the only way I can get them is by buying the original comics, because there's just no other format for them. So that's what I want to show. I want to show some recent-ish purchases that I've made of old comics from the 80s and 80s and 90s, and just give like a little bit of a potted history of why I like them. Okay, so I'm going to try and put this on somewhere. This could get interesting. That's not going to work. Okay, we'll do it there. So the first one, and I've done this video highlighting this series. I picked this particular issue, one of my all-time favorite comics of the 80s growing up. And it scared me at first because it was so weird. If you think about it, comics in the early 80s, before the introduction of experimentation by Bill Sienkiewicz and other people like that, and David Mazzucchello, comics were very, very classic. How you saw superhero comics being drawn, but there was one artist called Trevor Van Eden, and I saw his work in a Batman annual, and I didn't kind of like it. And he did a Green Arrow miniseries, but there's a series that came out written by Robert Loran Fleming, who I really enjoyed, and it's a DC comic called Thriller. And this is when I realised comics don't have to look the same. You can take risks with the artwork. I mean, Trevor Van Eden, without him, he for me personally, I think he was a huge influence on artists like David Mazzucchello and that a lot. Very much. I mean, if you look at these layouts, just fantastic. Very, very experimental. It's still one of my all-time favorites. He did the first 7 issues, I think, and then Alex Nino, who's another great artist, took over. But I want to highlight this one because of this villain. It's the coolest villain in comics, in my opinion. He's called Scabbard. He was taken the mickey of in an Ambush Bug comic by Keith Giffen, who I adore. He's one of my all-time goats, Keith Giffen. But what was cool, I mean, this whole fight scene on a train, and look at the speed lines and everything. This was years before Danny Warren Johnson a lot did things like this. Years before manga became a thing in the States. But Scabbard, what I loved about him, he had this gnarly red mask, but he also, the reason it was called Scabbard, he kept his sword in his back, in his spine. So his scabbard was formed out of his natural flesh. They gave no explanation why that was. And it's just wonderful. And this whole comic, the whole fight scene is just one of the coolest fight scenes I've ever seen. The guy he's fighting is like an Elvis. There's like hints it could be a clone of Elvis, but it is just a full comic that is set. Most of the comic is just set on top of a speeding train, and there's this fight, and it's cool. If you ever get the chance, pick up Thriller. You will love it. And then another, like I mentioned, Warrior. Um, this is going to sound weird. A lot of people, when they talk about Warrior, they talk about um, things like Miracle Man or Marvel Man, as it was called back then, and V for Vendetta, and the Bo Jeffries saga and other strips, which were basically done by Alan Moore. Yeah, me too. Some of my all-time favorite stories. But what made me really get into Warrior, it was not Alan Moore. Well, it kind of was, and I'll explain. Alan Moore. This is my history of Alan Moore. I knew Alan Moore before Swamp Thing, before 2000 AD. I first got to know Alan Moore was when he did a newspaper. Well, it was a music paper called Sounds, and he did a strip in the back. He did the art. Well, he was a really good cartoonist, and it was called "The Stars My Degradation," which was a Mickey take of the classic Alfred Bester novel, "The Stars My Destination." And I think he called himself. He might have called himself something like Kurt Vile or something, like the singer. I'm sure he gave himself a different name anyway. Um, but "The Stars My Degradation" featured this character called Laser Razor, and featured this character called Press Button, who was this psychopathic cyborg. And in Warrior, they resurrected him, and they teamed him up with this character called Laser Razor, who was this female bounty hunter. And there's this like weird sex alien who was like this shapeless blob with little legs, like a pig with no face and wings, bit like the character from the Shang-Chi movie from recent years. And Warrior featured that comic, and it's written by Steve Moore, I think, in the comic. And so that's what made me buy Warrior, because I that character always stuck in my head when I read the old Sounds comic. And Steve Moore was, even though they had the same name, they weren't related, the same last name, they weren't related. But Steve Moore and Alan Moore kind of like batted off each other's story ideas and were like really strong, good friends. And so he basically gave the reins of Press Button to Steve Moore to do. But he called himself Pedro Henry in here, but it was Steve Moore. It's like an alias. And the artwork in the Laser Razor Press Button stories was superb. Very, very wonderful. I loved Steve Dillon's early artwork. There was a solid, like a solidness to it that it kind of lost in his more looser style. And I think not David Leitch, I forgot what his name, but another artist came on as well. But it was just wonderful. It was just wonderful, chaotic madness, the warrior story. And again, I do recommend hunting these down, Laser Razor and Press Button. I think they are quite readily available on eBay and places like that. But yeah, just wonderful. And Eclipse at the time in the 80s were my favourite independent comics. So when I saw Independent Comic Company, when I saw they were doing reprints of this, I had to pick them up. But like I said, lost them in the back page of time, but I managed to get a good deal on a full set recently. And then we'll take a switch from independence to Marvel. I've actually not got any DC on here. These aren't my coolest comics. Like I said, my coolest comics are in my collector's editions. Like I've got Zenith. I might give a little flick of some of my ones that really mean a lot to me afterwards. If we'll see how I go. But I've lost track of what I was saying. But yeah, so in the 70s and early 80s, I got American comics, but I also bought the British reprints as well because they did like Rampage magazine, which had really they were quite a chunky magazine, about 50 odd pages, And they had in glorious black and white reprints of things like the Defenders and the Hulk, the Rampaging Hulk comic and stuff like that. Um, and I think I saw this first of all in a black and white British comic, but I did buy the American comic when I saw it in like this second-hand comic shop in somewhere. But it was Captain America. I like Captain America, but I'm not a die-hard fan. But I do enjoy if he's written well. It can be a really really good like superhero kind of thriller kind of style. But this particular there's a triptych of stories, a trilogy of stories which featured Deathlock, and Deathlock's my favourite Marvel character. So I was at the Manchester MegaCon this year with my daughter, and I found this comic stall, and they were selling basically packs and comics of all my childhood, and they're quite reasonably priced. But obviously, I wanted to budget. I wanted to just be sensible with what I got. But I picked up the Captain America comics, what I had years ago, for quite a decent price. But this particular one is quite possibly my all-time favourite comic cover for Marvel. It's yeah, I'd say it could be my all-time favourite Marvel comic apart from Marvel Fanfare one, which featured the Barry Windsor Smith and Thing story. But this cover for me is quite possibly. I'll take it out of the thing so you don't get glare. This cover for me is quite possibly the most iconic cover that's ever graced a Marvel comic because you've got this wonderful figurative drawing of Deathlock and his gun, but in the sight you have Captain America. Just genius. Mike Zeck for me, he's easily one of my top 15 artists. I just adore his artwork. So his run on Captain America is just sublime. It's just absolutely gorgeous. There's a cleanness to his artwork, but it kind of works on such a gritty, rough around the edges character like Deathlock. And so to have this in my hands was like a dream come true. I remember buzzing about this on a video when I came back from MegaCon. But yeah, one of my one of my treasured comics. I don't know what the price is for it. I don't know if it's collectible much. I paid a few pound for it. I just was pleased to reignite a memory because unfortunately the Epic collection that has this story in it's out of print, so I would have got it in that format otherwise. But yeah, very happy to get that. And then we're back on the indies. This is another Eclipse one. This I got a really good deal for this set, so I've just got to get the very last issue. Got the first 13 issues for £7 with no postage from eBay. And this was a series that my brother got. We kind of like he cherry picked some titles and I cherry picked other ones, so it meant we could get more comics as we were growing up. But I remember this coming out in the comic shop in the early 80s, and I was a bit intimidated by it. There's just something about the artwork because I was a few years younger than my brother. I wasn't familiar with this artist as much as he was because he used to read titles like the Master of Kung Fu Shang-Chi and things like that, whereas that was just a bit few years bit before my time. But this was Saber, and it was written by Don McGregor. The initial first few issues, but then illustrated by Paul Gulacy. But like I said, a few years later, before I got the graphic novel of this, because then I came to appreciate Paul Gulacy's artwork through seeing my brother um, get the comic. The graphic novel had a number of reprints. That's why I was able to get a copy. But yeah, this is just very, very cinematic, Paul Gulacy in his artwork. And this is just so iconic because let's thrust Jimi Hendrix into a post-apocalyptic science fiction world. Shades of things like Warren's The Rook and things like that. Very, very gorgeous artwork. And the colouring for the time is really good as well. So yeah, really happy with that. I do recommend trying to hunt this out. It's a fun comic. I am going to get issue 14, but I've only found one on eBay, and they are charging quite a bit for it. But if you balance it out, I've got the rest for £7, so I might do it. Might bite the bullet. And then finally, this was my obsession in the late 80s, in the 80s, early 90s, this character. And in particular, the artist and writer who basically took over this character. It was a public domain character for a number of years. It was a character who was big in the 40s and 50s, I think. And then Michael T. Gilbert, who kind of became popular with the PC, and I think first took it over afterwards, Elric series. He basically took the character on, and I read a lot of his color strips, what he did with Eclipse, which the character was Mr. Monster, by the way. I read a lot of the color strips what Eclipse did, which were fantastic. But the one for me, the definitive one, there's been some done by Tundra as well, which were really good. But the definitive series was the run that he did for Dark Horse. So it's Doc Stern, Mr. Monster. And this cover for me is just gorgeous. Michael T. Gilbert, he's an unsung hero. Not a lot of people talk about him, and it's such a shame because he has such a creative flair, and there's just something really, really exciting about his artwork. But this ticks all the boxes for me. Pulpy, horror, perfect artwork, a bit quirky, and yeah, perfect. So that's my 5 cool comics. Like I said, they're not my favoritist, not my coolest, but my coolest ones, like I said, are now mostly in collected editions, and quite a lot of them still digitally as well, just because that huge gap where I was just digital. So I'm going to pause it, and I'm going to show you some. Okay. Okay. Actually, what I'm going to do I'm going to do this as a. Oh, this isn't looking good. I'm going to do this as another video where I highlight some of my favourites collections in trade paperbacks. Okay, so hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll do another one now. Bye.